Support for Great Lakes Now update is provided by the Herb Family Foundation, the Wegge Foundation, the Community Foundation for Muskegon County, and the Richard C. Devereaux Fund for Energy and Environmental Programming at Detroit Public Television.
The Wegge Foundation has been committed to educating the public about the importance of clean air and water since its founding in 1967. The question, is the planet worth saving, is at the core of the Healing Our Water Coalition.
Good evening, and thanks so much for joining us for Great Lakes Now. I'm Christy McDonald. The health of the Great Lakes is a top priority for the advocates and scientists meeting here for Great Lakes Week in Grand Rapids. Tonight, we are focusing on the biggest concerns, the potential for a man-made environmental disaster due to oil and other contaminants, also coming up plastics in the water. And then we'll take a future look at the lakes with our roundtable and ask what's next. But we start with the transport of oil on the Great Lakes. There is concern about the age of the pipeline under the Straits of Mackinac. Michigan now has a pipeline task force looking to head off environmental disasters, but are we prepared to clean them up should one happen? I sat down with Andy Buxbaum with the National Wildlife Federation and Jerry Popiel, Management and Preparedness Advisor with the 9th U.S. Coast Guard District. So let's get into this discussion because this has been in the headlines for the last year and talking about the pipeline specifically in the Straits of Mackinac. Andy, I want to start with you. What are the major concerns that we've seen over the last month or so?
Well, we know that there's, as you said, this pipeline carries 23 million gallons a day. It's 61 years old. It's never been replaced. We just had a study that came out that looked at what would happen if there were a rupture. And the scientist that performed the study was originally from the government, the federal government, NOAA, and he concluded this would be the worst place in the Great Lakes to have a spill that would be virtually impossible to contain, and that it would go as far, it would go literally 50 miles either direction, very difficult to predict because of the way the currents run. So we can't be in a mode of cleanup. We have to be in a mode of prevention. We can't let this spill happen, which means we need that pipeline rerouted or replaced.
So, Jerry, when Andy says virtually impossible to contain and an ever-shifting, climate, or how do we actually clean this up? What is the plan in place should something like that happen?
Okay, there are area contingency plans set up for every area of the Great Lakes, and this is one of them. And it really varies depending on what the product is spilled, how much of it is, what the weather is like, and what the currents are doing through the straits or any other location. So our plans take all that into consideration. At the end of the day, whatever happens the day of an incident, that's going to drive the response. The good thing is that a lot of what's part of the response system is not going to change day to day. The people who are running it, the equipment that we're going to bring in, those things, we practice those all the time. As a matter of fact, for the pipeline, we're having an exercise next week, an industry-led Straits of Mackinac pipeline exercise to do exactly that. So,
is it a possibility, Andy, to reroute that? Enbridge has had that for a number of years, and they show no signs that they're going to try to reroute any of that.
Well, reroute or replace. And the reason we're saying one or the other is because we don't have the data yet to know whether that's possible. There are other pipelines that go through the Great Lakes region. There are other options for transporting the oil. There's other places. In fact, there's places where we can possibly reduce our dependence on oil. The difficulty is that Enbridge has been pretty closed with the information. No one really knows whether rerouting yet is possible, which is why we also have replace in there. We do know that it's possible to replace that line. It's got to be done the right way. It's not going to be cheap, but on the other hand, the entire Great Lakes, the brand of our region is at stake. So this is not just an environmental or ecological or recreational or even drinking water threat. This is a threat to the entire quality of life for our region. It sounds like doomsday, it sounds like apocryphal, but think about what would happen to the brand of the Great Lakes if we had an oil spill the size of the Deepwater Horizon, for example. It would be a catastrophe that it would take decades to recover from. We didn't see that one coming. We know this is there. We know it's 61 years old. We know this one is coming sooner or later. Let's do something about it now.
We're coming off a 4-year anniversary of the spill in Kalamazoo. And I think, Jerry, when people think about an oil spill, they think about things that rise to the top. But you're also prepared to deal with things that are heavy oils that sink down into the bottom. Explain that.
That's correct. There's a number of different products that we call heavy oils. One of them is called dilbit, a diluted bitumen, and that was the subject of the Kalamazoo spill. It's different in that it has diluent added to it to make it flow in the pipeline. When that's spilled, it'll float for a while because of that diluent, but as it weathers off due to evaporation and things, the diluent goes up in the air and that heavier product sinks. In the Kalamazoo instance, they recovered a lot of it before it sank, but then what sunk provided a lot more challenges.
So when you say a lot more challenges, what do you have to do?
Okay, so typically the response strategies for a floating oil involve booming it off and then either using sorbents or vacuuming or skimmers to take it off the surface of the water. And that's there's a state of industry for that. Removing oil from the bottom, I would say the state of the industry is not as robust. There are some technologies, a lot of things that were tried at Enbridge, at Kalamazoo. Some worked, some didn't. And then in a deep water, like in a Straits of Mackinac or Lake Superior incident, the technology in that kind of environment really hasn't been tested nearly as much.
Okay, we're talking about pipeline, Andy, but we're also looking at freighters who are moving a lot of this through the Great Lakes region. What are some of the concerns there?
Well, an oil spill, like an Exxon Valdez type running aground, sinking. Lake Superior is a tough lake. It's like an ocean, and bad things happen. And park ranger once told me there were 100,000 shipwrecks since the beginning. They've been keeping records in Lake Superior alone. That's not the kind of place you want to risk something sinking, a freighter running aground, a rupture. So there are risks for any form of oil transport. But when you're talking about oil, putting a tanker in Duluth and shipping it all over the Great Lakes, the risks increase astronomically. So again, that's why when we talk about pipelines, it's hard to say just stop it entirely, because then you force into other modes of transportation that could be as risky. So that's why we have to make sure that whatever we're doing now is safe to prevent any rupture from occurring, pipelines or anything else.
I think we're seeing a lot more awareness from the public in terms of what's happening on our waterways. And Jerry, I'm going to let you get the last word on this. Are we finally getting a lot of cooperation from a lot of different agencies in a look, if something does happen, how prepared are we, and do we have the proper tools to be able to address it and address it quickly?
Absolutely. We like to say that oil spill response is a team sport that really cuts across all levels, from federal down to state, local, tribal, across industry. So absolutely, the cooperation is critical, both in the planning and preparedness for looking ahead to incidents when they happen, and then in the response phase when they actually do happen. The cooperation amongst everyone is critical.
Jerry Popiel, Andy Bucksbaum, thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Turning now to the problem of microbeads. They're in many products that we use every day, from facial soaps to hand sanitizers, and now they're getting into our water supply.
What if you could shrink your pores just by washing your face?
Microbeads have been all the rage in hand sanitizers, body wash, and facial scrub, even toothpaste. They're supposed to help remove dead cells or tighten pores, as the product in this commercial claims. But they worry Olga Leandris.
If you think about how many of these are being used daily and washed down the drain, it's quite staggering.
Leandris is the research manager for the Alliance for the Great Lakes.
This is something that impacts the ecosystem, the wildlife, by entangling fish and birds ingest these particles, and it impacts their health. But also it's a sort of a cultural, issue, because people who grow up around the Great Lakes and go to the beach don't want to go to a beach that's dirty and littered by plastic items.
Scientists are also seeing evidence that the microbeads are reaching the water. At Loyola University Chicago, Professor Timothy Holine and his student researchers are looking for the plastic beads in samples of water taken from rivers in and around Chicago, as well as Lake Michigan. Last year, Sherry Mason at the State University of New York in Fredonia found anywhere from 1,500 to 1.1 million microbeads per square mile in the Great Lakes, the world's largest source of fresh water.
What we're interested in doing is determining the concentration of microplastic that's in the rivers, determining the source of microplastic, and also the different types of these small plastic pieces that we find in the river.
So far, Holine says his research shows that the synthetic microbeads are coming from treated wastewater that flows into sanitary canals and rivers, which feed into larger bodies of water.
Our initial findings from the North Shore Channel showed very high concentrations of microplastic downstream of a wastewater effluent source. And in fact, our concentrations were higher than what had been found in the ocean. So not only did we find it, but we found a lot of the material.
In June, Governor Pat Quinn signed into law legislation making Illinois the first state in the union to ban the manufacture and sale of personal care products containing synthetic plastic microbeads. The new law requires that the beads be removed from manufacturing by the end of 2018, and the products can no longer be sold starting at the end of 2019. And since major manufacturers make products for the entire country, other states will begin to notice the change on their store shelves as well, whether or not they've passed their own ban. Leandris, whose organization was pushing for the ban in Illinois, wanted the products gone sooner.
We would have liked to have seen a more compressed timeline for phase out. The sooner you can get these companies to make products available with alternatives, the better, and less of it ends up in the waterways.
Two organizations representing the personal care product industry worked with the environmental advocates and lawmakers to craft the Illinois bill. Representatives from the Personal Care Products Council declined an on-camera interview, but in a statement said, quote, "Our industry takes concerns regarding the presence of plastic microbeads in the environment very seriously. Many personal care products companies have voluntarily committed to discontinue formulating with plastic microbeads in cleansing products in favor of other viable alternatives, despite the uncertainty associated with the science." It is true that the long-term impact of the microbeads on the environment is unknown, and scientists are looking into how they might carry other organisms and chemicals.
One of the concerns is that the microbes on that plastic could be pathogenic. They might be disease-causing, and they may be kind of dispersed further in the environment on a plastic surface than they would on a natural surface.
And because the beads float on the water's surface, fish mistake them for food. The plastic alone is bad for fish health, but so are the microbes that the beads can carry.
Once the plastic is inside their guts, it can actually come off. So it may represent a kind of delivery mechanism for these harmful chemicals that just didn't exist previously.
Among other unanswered questions, do humans end up unknowingly eating the plastic after it's been consumed by fish?
There really is no research on the long-term impact of microbeads or other forms of microplastic because we've only just recently started looking for them.
Microbeads end up in the waterways because water treatment plants simply can't catch them. They're too small.
So small that even if there's a sand filter in a plant, it doesn't stop them from passing through the plant and into the water environment.
This is the third step in the water treatment process, where water is aerated, so lighter material rises to the top and heavier waste sinks to the bottom. But somewhere in the mix are still the microbeads, which make it through this entire multi-step process and are sent out to the sanitary and ship canal along with fully treated water. Pretty much nothing that you all can do about that.
Not without a significant investment. So,
David St. Pierre is the executive director of the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Greater Chicago. He argues we should focus on prevention.
If we were to adapt our plants to deal with microbeads, it would be a very expensive process. If we deal with it on the front end and take care of it before it's a problem by eliminating it as a pollutant source, very inexpensive way to deal with the problem.
Finding a new problem in our freshwater ecosystems is alarming and concerning, and we should all be worried. But I think what the Illinois ban on microbeads has shown is that once we become aware of the problem and the scale and the context and the sources, we can really start to take some real action towards some meaningful solutions.
Legislatures in New York, California, and Ohio are considering bans similar to Illinois. Instead of plastics, some manufacturers are already planning to use natural ingredients like apricot seeds, sand, or oatmeal to achieve the same goals.
All right, it is time to put things that we've talked about at Great Lakes Week in perspective. Joining me now is Patrick Doran with the Nature Conservancy, Christy Meyer with the Ohio Environmental Council, and Joel Brandmeier, president of the Alliance for the Great Lakes. It's good to see all of you. Thanks for being here. So let's start off now with algal blooms, the first topic here that are plaguing Lake Erie. We've heard a lot about the science, what causes them, the best practices to head them off, but is there some kind of decision on the next course of action now? Patrick, I'm going to let you start with that first.
Yeah, I think we need to focus on strategy. The science, is good enough. I mean, we still have many questions there, but we need to focus on implementing strategy, and we need to hit the problem from all aspects of all directions, right? There's great programs working with farmers on fertilizer applications, 4R, but we also need to think about the practices on that land, and we also need to think about how those streams have been altered and changed over time to move that water off the land. So we need to hit the problem at each aspect.
And Christy, I know that you've been doing some work with some of the farmers and trying to get the word out. Are you finding that more and more agriculture, they're using these best practices?
A lot of farmers are going to sign up for these programs. What I would say, though, is that we really need the governors and the premiers of Ontario and Quebec, and the 8 Great Lakes governors to really stand up and commit to setting limits to reduce phosphorus or nutrients flowing into our waterway, and then commit to implementing or developing and implementing a plan. And certainly we need to kind of use both carrots and sticks when it comes to agriculture. I mean, if I wanted to open up a business, I'd have to go and apply for permits. A lot of these farms are somewhat like businesses.
So now, Joel, we're seeing the regulations start to come into this piece.
Well, we haven't yet, but I think what we are seeing in what the crisis in Toledo has highlighted is that this is a serious problem for Lake Erie. It's a serious problem for the Great Lakes as a region. These algal blooms are happening in other parts of the Great Lakes as well. And so Christy's comment about asking the leaders of the states and the provinces to step up and do something about it is right on. We're actually asking a lot from our land in the Great Lakes right now. We're trying to produce a lot of produce, a lot of grain, and a lot of dairy, and it's not clear that we can keep doing that and maintain clean water with the way things are going right now.
All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the next topic. Aquatic invasive species. The topic of Asian carp has not gone away. There doesn't seem to be a lot of political will or money to separate Lake Michigan at the Chicago area waterway system. So where are we in the battle against invasive species? And Joel, I wanted to start off with you on this.
I actually think we are making progress in the move to separate the Great Lakes from the Mississippi River. The best long-term solution to this problem is really to put physical barriers in where you've got the Asian carp threat coming to the Great Lakes. There was some success, there's been some success in Minnesota on a smaller scale with the idea of physical barriers, and actually physical barriers are being used around the Great Lakes region and other places outside of Chicago. So I do continue to think that's the right solution. The trick is it's going to require a great deal of work on things like flooding and water quality improvements in Chicago before you can actually do that. And there's been some momentum starting to build down there in Chicago.
A lot of infrastructure. And Christy, we're talking about Asian carp, but also they're testing right now for grass carp and doing some studies in Ohio.
Yeah, they are doing some studies in Ohio. The grass carp they're in the Sandusky River and have made their way into Lake Erie. I wanted to feed off a little bit of what Joel said.
Sure.
In Ohio, I think it's really substantial that the states have stepped up and tried to do their part to separate those connections. And in Ohio, we have 4 connections, and 3 of them we will have done in 2 years. So it's fantastic to see that the states are really stepping up and doing their part. And there is a lot more that needs to be done in Chicago, but we need the permanent hydrological separation.
Other invasives that we should be watching out for, Patrick?
Yeah, I think the Asian carp is interesting, but it's one of many right now, and it's one of many in the future. So I think Joel mentioned that we can get to some long-term solutions, but I think we'll be probably seeing some movement on interim solutions. The Chicago area waterway system is a little more complex than some of the spots in Ohio. Not that those are easy, but it's very complex in Chicago. So I think what we're going to be seeing is perhaps some interim solutions that can happen more immediately, because that long-term solution is going to take it's a long-term solution. It's going to take some time.
And a lot of money. All right, yeah. I want to jump now to the adjustment to climate change. We've had a soggy summer. We're seeing extreme weather events in terms of rain and flooding. How are we adjusting with climate change and how it affects the lakes and lake levels? And Patrick, I'm going to start with the scientist here.
Yeah, one of the most interesting things I saw just the other day on Twitter was comparison pictures of last year lake levels and then this year lake levels at the same place, right? And last year they were like 15 feet out this way, and this year they were 15 feet that way. And I think the biggest thing to me is you have to be adaptable. We have to manage and plan in a way that is adaptable. And so, what does that actually mean? We see some great work in some cities, like here in Grand Rapids, but a lot of other places all around the Great Lakes are just in the earliest stages of just thinking about it. We need to get more actions on the ground that can handle all that types of change.
Are you seeing more adaptation, Christy?
We are. We're starting to see a little bit more in Ohio. I think we're a little bit behind some of those places. I also think, though, it's important to remember about water quantity, and we have the Great Lakes Compact that's going to be that they're going to be looking at how the compact is really doing in terms of protecting our water quantity. That was put in place in 2008, and just this coming year, everyone needs to have their management program in place on how they're going to manage the waters within the basin. So it's really important that we we also look at those types of things as we move forward.
Joel, last quick word on adjusting to climate change and how we deal with the lakes.
I think Patrick had it right. You know, the climate change, the emphasis is on the change. Lake levels are going to be up one year and down the next. You're going to get those extreme storms, but you're not sure when. It's really essential that cities are picking up the right data and using it to build the right plans for the long term, and that's what adaptation is all about.
All right. You know, we asked people at Great Lakes Week, what are the environmental issues that you think we'll be discussing next year? Take a look.
I think next year at Great Lakes Week, we're still, unfortunately, going to be talking about algal blooms and nutrient pollution.
Well, I think the number one issue next year and for many years after that is going to be climate change.
I hope we're going to be talking about how clean the Great Lakes have been getting in the last year.
Pipeline issues, I think, will continue to be something that we have to all look at with greater scrutiny throughout the Great Lakes region.
How do we bring in more local efforts to this conference and to the work? Because that's where it's happening. It's happening on the ground.
The safe handling and ultimate disposal of radioactive waste, much of which is being stored around the Great Lakes now, is going to be a major issue.
All right, so let's go ahead and take a look in the crystal ball if we're looking at that. What do you think, Patrick?
Two things here I like. I think we're going to see some major investments in agricultural practices, and we're going to see a release from the regional conservation projects through the USDA that's going to invest tens of millions of dollars in conservation, very targeted, very concentrated conservation projects. That's going to be happening over the next years. And what's neat about that is we also saw a message about diversity at this conference, and for diversity of people and all the socioeconomic and demographic things. But I think we're going to have a diversity of entities engaged in conservation. So what's neat about that RCPP program is it's a public-private partnership. Farm Bill is going to provide a set of money, but there's got to be an equal match from all the private entities that are engaged in this case agricultural work.
All right, Christy, what do you think?
Yeah, I would completely agree with Patrick. I think we'll still be talking, unfortunately, about nutrients. I think we'll make some progress, but I think that we'll be continuing to talk about how do we really solve this problem going forward.
Okay, and Joel, you get the last word here.
Yeah, well, I'll just add on with the agricultural issue. It's about nutrients, but it's about so much more. Agriculture is one of the three legs of the Great Lakes economic stool, and it's going to be for a very long time. We've got to challenge ourselves to figure out how that system can evolve into something that actually sustains Great Lakes water, because right now we're not doing that, and we've got a long ways to go. That's where I think the conversation is going in the coming year.
And we appreciate all your input this entire week here for Great Lakes Week. Joel Brandmeier, Christy Meyer, and Patrick Doran, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it. And finally tonight, a look at bringing back the Rapids to downtown Grand Rapids, Michigan.
For decades, many residents and visitors to Grand Rapids have often wondered, where are the city's namesake rapids?
Native Americans back in the day named Grand Rapids. We didn't name it Mediocre Rapids or Little Rapids, we named it Grand Rapids.
But 150 years ago, a large dam was built to run a logging mill, essentially drowning out the rapids.
As far as you can see up there, and as far as you can see down there, that's all formerly rapids.
As avid kayakers, Chip Richards and Chris Muller wondered, can you bring the rapids back?
Chris and I countless times have gotten in the car with our kayaks and we've driven hours and hours and hours to find whitewater, and it could be right here the whole time.
Muller and Richards started the nonprofit Grand Rapids Whitewater and joined forces with a team of scientists and engineers to help figure out how to effectively and safely bring back the rapids.
All of the basic elements are there for rapids. About 2.5 miles is 18 feet of drop in that section, which is super unique in the Great Lakes region.
The rapids are still there. They're just drowned out by the dam that exists there today. So it's not that we have to go in and create these rapids and build these rapids. All we have to do is modify the dam, lower the water level, and that whole stretch of rapids will be revealed.
A restoration project of this scale does present some environmental concerns. Will the modified dams allow invasive species in?
This is an enormous project that will have a huge impact on one of the most important ecological assets in Michigan. And so we have to be really careful.
We've always relied on science. You know, when we've been asked a question that's been a difficult question, we lean on our engineers and our scientists to give us answers.
What started as an effort to improve water recreation on the Grand River has turned into a $30 million river restoration project. reviving the river's fisheries and the city's overall economic health.
I believe the restoration of the rapids will redefine who we are as a people in relationship to the river.
For generations, the Grand River was not a priority. But today, Grand Rapids is looking to restore the river as the focal point of the city.
The project caught the attention of Governor Snyder. He talks a lot about placemaking and creating those unique and vibrant places, especially in urban communities.
Grand Rapids will one day be the outdoor urban recreation capital of the country. There is so much opportunity for mountain biking, stand-up paddleboarding, whitewater kayaking, surfing.
The Grand River Restoration Project was included in the Obama administration's Urban Waters Federal Partnership, which provides regulatory and political support to urban watershed projects.
I have, quite honestly, never seen anything quite like this. The attitude, the spirit around this project, and the collaborative nature of our intergovernmental work has assured me that it's going to be successful. And in fact, I think it's going to be wildly successful.
You know, we've got buildings over here that don't even have windows facing the river, and it's been like that for over 100 years. And finally, we're going to love this river again.
J'aime la plage. I love the beach, right?
Yeah. It's just so inspiring to see the community coming together to take part in a larger vision to restore this great place that we live in.
Looks beautiful. And that will do it for Great Lakes Now. Thanks so much for joining us for our coverage of Great Lakes Week here in Grand Rapids, Michigan. For everything Great Lakes, make sure you find us at greatlakesnow.org. For all of us at Detroit Public Television, I'm Christy McDonald. We'll see you next time.